So one of the reasons why I love literature so much is because you are able to leverage great books into an appreciation of other art forms. Just say you're interested in learning more about music, opera, for example, and you're reading through Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Tremendous novel. Well, you're not going to get too far into that novel before Tolstoy will essentially take you by the hand, if you let him, and lead you to Mozart's Don Giovanni. If music's not your thing and you're more interested in learning about the visual arts, and if your current big read is Herman Melville's Moby Dick, well, you get halfway through that terrific novel and Herman Melville gifts us some of the most incredible ekphrasis in all of literature. Ekphrasis is a rendering of the visual arts, like painting, using words. It's one of my favourite things. A poem that I personally return to every few months is a great example of ekphrasis. It's John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. You get halfway through Moby Dick and you are treated to a procession of descriptions of different paintings, and if you're interested in the visual arts, you can go, search them out, look them up, and slowly but surely widen your circle of connoisseurship into the visual arts too. So this is something that I have done liberally for a while now. When I talk about following rabbit holes and when I talk about living the great books, I believe that this is a strong component of that. If you truly want to breach the cosmos of a particular work, then this is a really great thing to do. But I never would have thought that literature was a great leverage into a skill like gardening. Recently, I was very kindly given some allotment so that I can grow some vegetables. And so I went down to the gardening centre, ready to pick the vegetables that I wanted to grow and eat. And I also wanted to grow some flowers in the garden. Obviously, I am an amateur when it comes to gardening. I'm a complete beginner. And what was really lovely is when I mentioned that I'm getting into gardening at the book club, so many members were super helpful, giving me links, giving me advice, being super encouraging, and I realised that, hey, a lot of lovers of literature are lovers of gardening and the natural world too, and there isn't actually a huge disparity there. It's kind of obvious if you think about it. And that realisation was emphasised when I went to the gardening centre, because I noticed that many of the plants were named after famous literary personages. That was quite a surprise. So I knew what kind of flowers I wanted to plant. I've always been really interested in flowers. I've always had them around the house, but I didn't realise that I would be compelled to pick the breed based on the name. So I wanted some roses, and I noticed immediately that one of them was named the Ancient Mariner. Now, if you know your romantic poetry, if you know your Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you'll know that the Ancient Mariner is one of the most brilliant, sublime, romantic ballads in all of literature. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend you get yourself a copy of Lyrical Ballads. That's William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This is a foundational text. It's incredibly influential. Every writer since then is in some way influenced by Wordsworth, but the poem that steals the show of that slim little book is most certainly The Ancient Mariner. I've been obsessed with this poem for years. The obsession took root in my second year at university. I developed a keen interest in the sublime, and I can still remember long snippets of the poem, and they come and disturb me whilst I'm going about my business. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. So one of the roses was named Ancient Mariner, and I thought, yeah, I'm having that. And then I found another rose which was called Gabriel Oak. And if you know your Thomas Hardy, you will know that Gabriel Oak is a protagonist in Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. The title of that novel is taken from another favourite poem of mine, a really good poem to mull over when you're in the country, but also a good poem to mull over whenever your thoughts turn to mortality and posterity, or lack of posterity. And Thomas Hardy is a really special writer to me. I'm currently making my way through rereads of The Woodlanders and The Return of the Native. Hardy definitely is one of the writers who is in my personal canon. Last year I took a little holiday, I retreated into the woods, and I took with me Thoreau's Walden. I really love his essay on reading. He's got another great essay on walking, something that I've been doing a lot of recently. But I also took Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and reading that incredibly pessimistic but beautiful novel in the depths of the English countryside was really quite a stunning thing, and I lived with that novel all over again. Thomas Hardy is an Eliotic writer. He's essentially an aesthetic descendant of George Eliot, though he does very different things from George Eliot. I don't believe he uses his novels as his essay form as extensively as George Eliot does, and I absolutely adore Wessex. The town and people of Middlemarch, for me, resonate with greater strength. In addition to seeing the hand of George Eliot in Thomas Hardy, Hardy, like Eliot, has that backwards looking, that sort of nostalgic reminiscing of an England that is no longer the England of one's childhood, and George Eliot was the first writer, the first English writer anyway, to do that in a significant way. In addition to George Eliot, I also see a heavy heaping of Percy by Shelley in the novels of Thomas Hardy. If you've ever found yourself wondering what it would be like if Shelley wrote novels, then look no further than Thomas Hardy. What a shame he cut his novel writing off at Jude the Obscure after a series of bad reviews. I believe Tess of the D'Urbervilles was also not received very well, it wasn't received favourably, and it got too much for Hardy, and for the rest of his life he embraced being a poet. His poetry's terrific too. I will always remember the very first time I encountered Thomas Hardy. It was before I went up to Oxford, and I was given some vacation reading, one of those huge reading lists that's really daunting and so big that you simply don't know where to start. Now for me, I started with a reread of Alice in Wonderland, and I also picked up Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles before I went to university for my first year. I was absolutely blown away by that first reading, but of course I was too young to really get the resonance of the novel. Returning to the novel in recent years, I find it to be a crushing experience. But I read Tess, I went to university, and I was keen to discuss it. And I remember sitting in a tutorial, I've said this story before, but I said essentially, I love Tess. Has Hardy written any more novels? And this memory will always stay with me because everybody laughed. They laughed because, of course, Thomas Hardy is incredibly prolific. Well, I went to a pretty bad secondary school, one of the worst in the country, and when I wasn't spending time in the library, I would bunk off with a stack of books that I had picked just because they interested me, just because the name looked interesting. And so when I was young, I was following a self-directed reading program. So at that age, I didn't realise that Thomas Hardy was incredibly prolific. And I remember feeling a bit foolish after that lecture. And I immediately went down to the high street and I went to the Oxford World's Classics store, which is no longer there. And I got myself an armful of his books, as many Thomas Hardy books as I could carry. And I'll always remember bumping into the same members of that tutorial group with this huge stack of Hardy novels as I made my way down the high street. Thomas Hardy ended up being my first year focus. I even tried to get through 3 of his novels in the Bodleian in one afternoon, which is definitely not recommended. And even today, I don't go very long without returning to Hardy, and so those roses were a nice reminder to go back to Thomas Hardy. They were a nice reminder to go back to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And so it was quite a joyous experience to discover that literature was once again helping me into a new area. And this is an area I'm really excited about. Something I've noticed recently is that many gardeners are indeed fans of great literature. And if one is a fan of great literature, it's probably a fair assumption to say that if the reader is not already into gardening and the natural world, that they could very well get into it. And it most certainly makes a lot of sense. When you're on the allotment or when you're planting, when you're in nature, you want to read those works that complement your experience. So you go back to Coleridge, you go back to Wordsworth, you find the poems about spring and summer, you find the poems about birds twittering in the trees, warblers and skylarks, and you go back to those novels that seem to be a slice of a simpler time before, perhaps a simpler time that didn't really exist. And in that returning to those poems and those novels, you yourself get to reclaim a little bit of that simpler time in the here and now. And it's an incredibly meditative experience to dig the soil, to plant the seeds. It's really tactile, so it's really pleasing. And all the while I have these snippets of poems and novels and ideas coming to me. In a recent lecture on Blood Meridian, we went through Cormac McCarthy's great essay, The Kukuli Problem, where he talks about how essentially our unconscious is smarter than us, whatever us is. Essentially, the unconscious is better equipped to solve mathematical problems, for example. It's a really bizarre thing to contemplate because the unconscious clearly does understand language, human language, but does not speak to us in the language we use. It speaks to us in pictures, dreams, symbols, and then it's up to us to interpret those pictures and symbols. And so a really important part of any deep reading program is giving yourself enough space. If you're reading a book that's truly great, the first thing you want to do is give yourself more sleep cycles. We all love to binge a good book now and then. Even some of the really fat books on the book club syllabus are bingeable if you have enough time, if you have enough hours in a row and you fall deeply in love with it. But my first recommendation when it comes to big books like Moby Dick and Middlemarch is to give yourself sleep cycles, because your unconscious mind is working through the themes and preoccupations of the work. And another great thing to do is to engage in those activities that keep your conscious mind at bay for a moment and allow your unconscious to unravel all of the different things you've been thinking about. So an activity like gardening is perfect for that. You're in the fresh air, you're in nature, it can be repetitive, it's very tactile. And another great activity for allowing your unconscious mind to unravel the great books you're reading is going on walks. Long walks. I've made it a habit recently to have one long walk per week and several shorter walks interspersed throughout the week. The long walk, the philosophy is inspired from my marathon training, because once per week you would have one long run, and the closer you get to the marathon, you want those long runs to be looking really big. They basically take up your whole day, essentially. It's a really fun thing to do if you've got the time. You run for hours and hours and hours, and then you gorge on food and you lie in front of the TV or with a stack of books for the rest of the day. It's good fun. As I'm not training for a marathon right now, I have decided to do a long walk per week. And so I pick a hiking route that looks like it's got a lot of variability in the countryside and the scenery, and maybe even has some cultural areas of significance along the way. Norman churches, for example. And it's always interesting seeing the signs that have been put up around the countryside. Signs warning that if you go in a certain field, there will be a bull. Signs warning you to please drive slowly because there are free-range children and animals roaming about. So all of this to say, if you're reading a great book, give yourself some downtime, allow your unconscious to work through it. I'm really excited to learn more about gardening. I've learned that gardeners are lovely people and are often fans of literature. Another thing that I've noticed relatively recently, although I've always been aware of this, is that Cormac McCarthy, we're deep reading Blood Meridian at the book club at the moment, Cormac McCarthy has the loveliest fan base. Now, if you've ever read Blood Meridian, that might come as a shock to you, because it's a brutal book about the scalpings that took place around the America-Mexico border in the mid-19th century. It's utterly brutal. In all honesty, though the prose is incredibly beautiful and sublime, it's also the most violent book I've ever read. That came all the more into focus recently when I picked up this book, which I want to talk to you briefly about in a moment. But something I've noticed with fans of Cormac McCarthy is they're the loveliest people. Cormac McCarthy, as well, by all accounts, is a very lovely man. But those who read Cormac McCarthy have really thoughtful, tender meditations and appreciations on his work. They're really kind people, they're thoroughly empathetic. And so I've been wondering why that is exactly. What is it about Cormac McCarthy that attracts such a positive, lovely, warm-hearted fan base? If you've noticed this too, then you might be able to weigh in and let me know what you think on that. But yes, okay, I want to talk to you about a mini side reading project that I'm making my way through, which has led me to Peter Carey's The True History of the Kelly Gang, which is a Booker Prize winner. I have been absolutely adoring this novel. It's essentially a romance, it's an adventure tale. It's an adventure tale for boys, and it's about this outlaw bush ranger in Australia called Ned Kelly. And if you don't know too much about Ned Kelly, I would highly recommend not learning anything before going into the book, because it makes it all the more incredible. Not too long ago, I went through this top 100 list of influential or great books written in English, put together by a fellow called McCrum at The Guardian. I went through the list and didn't realise until after I posted the video that it was a chronological list, which obviously made some of my outrage at the positions pretty funny, but it was still a pretty good list. And for me, I had read a huge amount of the books on the list, but I noticed that there were some areas, particularly with more contemporary books, particularly with prize winners, that I had personally shied away from. Now, I do love prize winners. I have some of my favourites. But overall, as many people know, I haven't been too impressed with many of the prize winners. So when one of the book club members said that she was working her way through the list, in addition to reading the plays of Shakespeare with us, in addition to reading Moby Dick, in addition to reading the Bible and everything that's going on at the book club, I thought, I'll do that. Every now and then I'll dip into the list and I'll work my way backwards, slowly. If it's a book I've already read, I'll reread it. If it's a book I haven't read, then I'll go in with an open mind. And I'm so glad I did, because this is a terrific book. Now, because I'm reading this up against Blood Meridian, I cannot help but say that it's not as good as Blood Meridian. As a commenter on a video told me recently, there isn't a single comma in this novel, and it's true. It's rather experimental, it's rather postmodern, but if you've read Cormac McCarthy, then this is nothing that you aren't already used to, so it's not too difficult. It's difficult if you're not used to more modern novels, but once you get into the story, oh my goodness, I was absolutely swept away. This has most certainly been some decent escapism for me. And after Peter Carey's novel, I believe we have J.M. Coetzee with Disgrace. We have Don DeLillo's Underworld, which is terrific. I love Underworld. I also love White Noise, very funny novel. And a couple of other slim, more contemporary reads. Another thing that I'm enjoying a lot is visiting secondhand bookstores and antique stores, and I've come to the conclusion that I actually prefer them to normal bookstores that sell new books, essentially. When you go to a secondhand bookstore, you never know what you're going to find, and very often you find a terrific bargain. You find these really old books, the kind of books that they just don't publish anymore, and it's really exciting to go there, run your finger across the spines and pick out whatever interests you, and if it's not too expensive, well, you have a treat for the rest of the afternoon. You can see some of my recent scores behind me. I absolutely adore this one. This is one that I read through quite a lot. I try to read this every day. This is a book of English poetry, has these really old ruffled pages, and it was published in 1915, and there's a tremendous selection. It's also really interesting to note who was left out around the turn of the century. Emily Dickinson doesn't seem to be in here. I believe there's one Walt Whitman poem and it's not one of his best, but hey, there's plenty of William Wordsworth, there's plenty of Keats, there's plenty of Tennyson, so it's an interesting relic to rifle through of an evening and maybe give oneself the assignment of learning a couple by heart. There was also this 3-volume set called The World's Great Books in Outline, and again this was published in a time before online encyclopedias, and so it's essentially just the great books compressed, but I picked it up because I absolutely adore some of the pictures that they have chosen to go next to the books that they are explaining. Let me show you what else I'm enjoying at the moment. I recently had a bit of a book haul with the Penguin Modern Classics. I think this is a great series, and I'm most interested in the plays. Now, I'm always reading Shakespeare in depth. A day doesn't go by without reading Shakespeare. You might find it interesting to know that my first love was the theatre. So I do try to read at least a play a month or a handful of plays a month. We recently had a podcast on Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Terrific play. It makes for a great pairing with Stacey Schiff's The Witches. Stacey Schiff is a terrific historian, so her work on the Salem witch hunts is illuminating stuff. And of course, as you might know, The Crucible was actually not really about witch hunts, it was about McCarthyism, but it's a work that is ever relevant. It's relevant for every single time and for all time. The play that I'm on at the moment is Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, good play. I'm also enjoying a reread of Peter Brook's The Empty Space. Many of you know that I'm a huge fan of Harold Bloom, but Harold Bloom was most certainly not a huge fan of Peter Brook. Peter Brook, who directed and produced many Shakespeare plays. Bloom saw Brook as being part of the problem of modernizing Shakespeare, the problem of being experimental with Shakespeare. But I must say, I do rather like Peter Brook, and I love what he's written here about the holy theatre, the rough theatre, and the deadly theatre. If you're interested in drama and dramatic literature, then Peter Brook is a good read. I'm also reading Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, he's great. I picked up William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch, and I'm not quite sure why. I did my final dissertation on the Beat Generation, which also involved a foray into Burroughs and his cut-up technique, the soft machine, junkie, that sort of thing. But returning to Naked Lunch now that I'm a bit older, it's definitely an interesting one, but I'll keep you posted on that. I've got a few big projects that I'm working on at the moment. We've got, at this point, dozens of lectures running simultaneously. We've just reached the end of Moby Dick, and honestly, for me personally, that's one of the most sublime endings in all of literature. I cannot help but read it aloud and just relish the words. And the power and the poignancy is never lost on me. I'm currently in the process of putting together a long-running series on the Gothic and horror literature, with Dracula being the focal text, and I must say I'm absolutely brimming with excitement for this one. It's going to be a really fun one. Also, in preparation for our upcoming Samuel Richardson Clarissa lecture series, I'm giving that a nice, deep, immersive reread, and once again finding myself utterly swept away. We'll have a video soon on how to read Clarissa, how to break into it, the paradigms that you should be bringing to the book. The thing that always helped me when I first read Clarissa was keeping in mind something that Colin Wilson in The Craft of the Novel wrote about. He was actually talking about Richardson's Pamela, but he was keen to impress upon us the fact that during Richardson's time, we're talking about a time where the novel is on the rise, but that doesn't mean everybody had liberal access to entertainment. It was barely a fraction of what we have today. If one struggles with Clarissa, it may be because we're being bombarded from all angles by short-form media 24/7. Neil Postman has a great book on this, a really proleptic, visionary work written, I believe, in the 80s, called Amusing Ourselves to Death. But if you read that book, you'll think, how on earth did he not write this during the social media generation? The thing is, we're absolutely saturated with content today, but those first readers of Clarissa, and of course Dr. Samuel Johnson said that if you were to read Richardson for the story, your impatience would be so much fretted that you would hang yourself. You must read him for the sentiment and consider the story as giving occasion to the sentiment. First readers were absolutely hooked by Clarissa, and that's because they probably didn't have too many books on the go. They might have had a smattering of poetry here and there if they were lucky, a novel now and then. They might have been lucky to have been read something from a periodical by a family member, but for the most part, one's entertainment back then came in the form of the weekly church sermon. And when Clarissa came along, and when Pamela came along, everybody would wait, most likely incredibly impatiently, for the sermon to end so that they could congregate outside and gossip and discuss everything that happened with Clarissa and Lovelace. And so one really needs to go into Clarissa with that mindset. And if you do, the story or the sentiment will most certainly sweep you up and take hold of you. So I can't wait to hear what readers make of Clarissa. It's one of my personal favourite novels, so I have a little bit of investment in people liking it. We also have James Joyce's Ulysses looming like a leviathan on the horizon, and that's going to be a fun one too. And fun definitely is the right word, because you know you've read Ulysses correctly if you find yourself laughing out loud. James Joyce didn't actually want to confuse people. Yes, he's put together a conundrum. Yes, he laboured for years over Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, not because he wanted to flip off the reading public, as some people think, but because he wanted to put together a puzzle. He wanted to put together illusions built on illusions that would keep readers preoccupied for years and years and years. He wanted to delight an admittedly very small readership, the kind of readership that would get allusions to Dante and Homer and Shakespeare and Berkeley and Aristotle all mixed into one and find themselves laughing. No, many people can't appreciate Ulysses, but I strongly believe that with a little bit of a guiding hand, Ulysses actually isn't that difficult, and it most certainly is possible that you find yourself enjoying it. But of course, one must emphasize that it is incredibly dense. If you look at just one page of one of my old copies of Ulysses, you'll see that the marginalia is pretty crazy, but it could be much worse than this, honestly. Ulysses is still an impressive and influential literary specimen to contemplate today, but I often think about those first readers. Again, the first readers of Joyce, the first readers of Proust, both writers doing very similar things, but wildly different in aesthetic. By all accounts, they didn't have any influence on each other. I believe James Joyce read a little bit of Swann's Way and thought it rather pedestrian. Proust likely didn't read any Joyce at all. I think they met once and complained about their health conditions. Joyce would be at Proust's funeral when he died in 1922. But one thinks about those first readers, because a first reader coming to Ulysses, and Joyce had to fight to get this novel out. It was censored, it was blocked. He had to fight ferociously for his art. One certainly does think that those first readers, for the most part, must have been pretty confused. Because when Ulysses came along, what was the reading public used to? In all honesty, they were used to novels from the likes of George Eliot, Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, Joseph Conrad. And so this must have been a really startling thing. This was James Joyce hurling a defiant brick through the literary tradition. Now, speaking very briefly of George Eliot, one of the things that I'm most enjoying at the moment is a reread of Middlemarch following the original serialised publication schedule. We have a lot of book club members enjoying the ride too. Yes, there are members that couldn't help themselves and needed to binge through it. That's completely understandable. My first read of Middlemarch was a binge, but if you follow the rhythm of the original publication, which had the first book of roughly 100 pages, published at the end of 1871, Miss Brooke, and went through 1872, what you'll notice is that the effect of the novel is all the more poignant. The world of Middlemarch feels incredibly lived in. It feels like you are there in that town. It feels like the characters are your friends and acquaintances and you know them. You are living alongside these brilliantly rendered characters over the long term. Quite honestly, it's a really joyous experience. And at time of recording, if we were that first reader, George Eliot would have published her third volume very recently. And so we'll be dissecting that and appreciating that at the book club. Anyway, I think we will leave it there for today. Let us know if you enjoyed this chat. I'm going to start doing more vlogs, more rambling talks, if people enjoy it, where I keep you updated about what I'm getting up to and the books I'm enjoying. And so every now and then we'll sit down and we'll have a little chat about books together and simply see where the conversation and life takes us. Do let us know what books you've been enjoying recently and what life is looking like for you right now. What have you been up to? I'm interested, let us know. And I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you so much for watching, thank you for being here, and happy reading everybody. Bye bye for now.